Bethany, thanks for making it to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Sure, I'm excited to have you. So I want to start with something you and I worked on a project maybe almost 2 years ago now at my former employer, which is crazy. A lot's happened since then.
It's crazy.
But there, you said something when we were working on that project, and I don't know if you even remember it. It may have been totally off the cuff, but it's really stuck with me since we worked on it. Basically, you said that narrative is stronger than numbers, and you were referencing the stock market and business and investment and all these types of narratives in the world that kind of can overpower data or what the numbers say. And I just want to start there. Where did you figure that out? When did that really hit that that was true, that narrative is actually stronger than the numbers?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's been a slow realization, and I'm glad I put it so succinctly. I don't think I could do that again. So thank you for reminding me of that. But I think there's this perception that the business world is this cold, numbers driven, totally rational place. And all you have to do is look at the number of disasters we've had in over the last 20 years plus to see that so many times people are driven by the story, not the underlying economic reality. And I guess the first time that hit home for me was Enron, where literally nobody understood how the company made its money. And yet people thought this was the greatest company in the world. And it was all story. And I was so struck by the fact that this world of data and numbers and quantitative people was actually far more driven by emotions and story than by any of the underlying numbers. And you see that time and time again. The GameStop saga, right? Which is
Hmm.
which is playing out now. Again, it's emotion. It's us versus them. It's taking down this hedge fund. It has nothing to do with the underlying fundamentals of GameStop, right?
Right, yeah.
So it's all this emotional battleground. And I've laughed on another front because it is this, traditionally, at least the business world has been a more male world, right? And then there's this notion that women are the emotional ones. And I
Right.
was, oh no, just play around on Twitter for a little while or look at the business world and you see who the emotional ones are.
That's such a good point. I love that. But yeah, I think you're spot on. And I even think, too, since you said that, it's obvious in the business world that's how things are. But I even see it in just the broader world now, too, whether it could be all kinds of controversial topics. If you dig into data, you're going to find very different answers than what common narratives say.
Right.
But story generally wins. It just wins over our imagination. So you've been investigating the business world for a long time, and you always find these larger than life personalities. Like the story we worked on together was about Aubrey McClendon from Chesapeake. You've written about Elon Musk. What draws you to these larger than life business figures? What about them makes you so fascinated to write about them?
Yes, and I'll address that just to go back to the previous thread for sure. Fracking is another example of that, right? It's the
Yeah.
narrative of American energy independence which prevailed over the actual numbers of fracking, which never made economic sense. So,
Right.
or only in limited quantities. Anyway, I think it's because of the English major in me that these figures are almost Shakespearean in a way, and
Hmm.
that's what keeps me so interested in this sort of work. Is that there are all these stories of human nature. They're so rarely these people setting out to do bad things. They're stories of self delusion and rationalization, and often very grand ambitions, and ambitions that get twisted, and how that plays out through these larger than life characters. I'm also just innately interested in people who have the charisma, the intellectual charisma to get other people to believe in them. And it's this wild card quality that you can't predict because it can be people who otherwise aren't physically prepossessing, who nonetheless have this quality of intellectual charisma that gets other people to follow them like a Pied Piper.
Right.
Jeff Stelling at Enron for sure was that way. Aubrey McClendon was that way in spades. And the WeWork saga of Adam Newman is all one of those stories. He was literally larger than larger than life, and he had that same quality that he was able to get people to believe, at least for a while, in an idea that really was nothing more than renting out real estate.
Yeah.
Um, And so these things, at their best, they drive our world forward. I don't think you want a world where these characters don't exist, but at their worst, they crash and burn.
Right. Yeah. I think you're spot on. I've made a critique of Elon Musk the other day on Twitter, and it's all of a sudden this army of people come after me. And it was like a pretty harmless statement, but it was wild that he has a legit army of people ready to go to war for him. And you're totally right. It's like this occulted personality type thing going on.
Yeah, and it ties back to our thing about story, right?
Yeah.
Because Elon Musk has successfully crafted the story too, and different people cling to different versions of the story, whether it's going to Mars, the guy who's going to get us to Mars, and so that attracts a whole crew of people, or the environmentalist, that he's the guy driving the electric car revolution. And so different people find different things in his story, and he's been very clever about allowing those multiple narratives to exist so that he can enlist that army.
Right. You wrote, we don't have to spend too much time on Elon, but you did write a piece on him. And I'm curious, can you just give me the brief overview of what you were saying in that? Because I was blown away by reading it, because it was just a side that I had never really seen, because there is this narrative about the guy, and I felt like you uncovered some new things. It was all about the Solar City experiment in Buffalo, New York. Can you just give me the rundown of what happened there?
So Musk very cleverly capitalized on Andrew Cuomo's desire to rebuild upstate New York with $1 billion of investment, and Musk got God, I can't remember the number now, but like 700 million for this factory that is a Solar City factory in upstate New York that never functioned the way it should. And so this all got wrapped into the narrative of the acquisition of Solar City by Tesla. And I told that story not because I think it does show a side of Elon Musk that his fanboys, and they're often boys, that his fanboys don't want to acknowledge, which is how clever he is about getting government money. So the idea of this guy who's just outside the system, no, not at all. He's very clever about capitalizing on subsidies from the government. And there's also an argument that he's so pure, he doesn't really care about the money. No, one of the things that happened when Tesla bought Solar City was that loans Elon Musk and his compatriots had made to Solar City got paid off by Tesla so that they didn't have to lose money. And it also showed Musk's willingness to flat out lie. He presented this, it was the fall of, was it 16, right before the merger, this grand vision of the solar roof as this fait accompli, as this product that was done, that was ready to be rolled out. And there's still no solar roof. so
Right.
so I thought all of those things were worth knowing about Musk and worth shining a light on. That doesn't mean, though, that Musk isn't gonna be the next. That doesn't mean that people took that to mean that thought Tesla was going to go under. And for a while, I probably would have leaned that way. I for sure never would have invested in Tesla. But as long as Musk can keep raising money, he might be able to pull it off, right? So it's not a dispositive. This means that Tesla is going to go broke or that Elon Musk is a fraud. It's more this guy's complicated,
Right. Well, and I think that's a problem with our society at large, is that both things can be true. The guy could get to Mars, but he can also lie a lot too. Like, both things can be true, and yet it seems like we're living in this world where if he lies one time, he's a fraud, or if he gets us to Mars, he never lies. But no, both things can coexist. But in the clickbaity world we live in, it's hard for both of those things to exist together.
Yeah, it is. People want heroes or villains, and they don't want nuance. And the reality is, we're all nuanced. But I've often said one of the things I think about a lot is this line between the visionary and the fraudster, and what is it really? And sometimes I think it's just luck.
Right.
Like the fraudster is the visionary interrupted.
100%. That makes me think of Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. It's, that there's this narrative that she's just this lying, manipulative, horrible person, but put side by side next to a lot of these founders, it's not that dissimilar of a story. She just got caught faster. You know what I mean?
Right. You can raise a question: if she had continued to be able to raise billions of dollars, could she have gotten this thing to work eventually? And would anybody have known if it weren't for John Kerry's excellent reporting? If she had continued to be able to raise the money, might she have gone down in history as a visionary? The difference with her is that she was playing with people's health, and people's lives.
Sure.
And that's for we there is a different level of responsibility that comes with that, for sure, that
Yeah.
she was not willing to take on. Whereas in the tech world, if you've got your vaporware and you're lying and it doesn't really work, it's not going to kill people, at least.
Right. Right. Totally.
Although the rocket going to Mars that doesn't work might kill people.
Yeah, good point. Or cars that don't function right, or semis, or all the things Musk is building.
Which has already happened. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we can get off the big founder question after this, but I'm curious, maybe what are some things that you find in these personalities that you've researched that kind of are similar in their personalities across the board? What are some similar things? And those can be good and bad things, because I think they're clearly are both.
I think a willingness to believe in yourself and damn the torpedoes, charge ahead with your vision despite other people saying it's not going to work. To push the envelope with people who work for you in terms of this is going to work, this is going to work. We just have to keep going, but an outsized belief in oneself, a big dream, an idea that you're changing the world somehow, that this thing that you're doing is so critically important that it's an end justifies the means type of thing, that because this thing you're doing or building is so critically important, it's okay to lie. And I would say definitely a quality of belief in oneself. And I used to think that belief excused bad behavior because you believe. But I remember a family friend said to me when I was working on the Enron book, he said, Bethany, the worst crimes in human history have been committed by people who believe. I think on some level that's true. And so belief itself is this tricky thing. Part of you may believe, part of you're using that as a rationalization for what you're doing. You're burying your own doubts. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. So I guess moving on, I want to jump into our shared world a little bit, and that is the state of modern journalism. And this is a world that I recently left, and I think you've been out of somewhat in the sense that haven't been working in a newsroom maybe in the same way that you used to. But I just want to get your initial thoughts. What is your current thought? Like, what do you currently believe about the state of modern journalism?
So I don't think it's great. There were problems with the old world of journalism too. It's not like that was perfect, but everybody has a little more freedom or incentive to be better when there's lots of money. So back in the old days of Time Inc., the magazine empire that I grew up in, there was a lot of money. There was a lot of advertising money. So you could take on a big advertiser and write a tough story about them and lose that advertising, and you could do that. There was a real separation between church and state, and there weren't these constant demands for people's time and attention. So you could write a headline that reflected what the story actually was, instead of writing a headline that would get people to click on it, because who really cares if they read the piece? At the end of it all, as long as they clicked on it, that triggers the right algorithms for the ads, and so you get paid for it. And I think too, another strength, and it wasn't always a strength, but was that there was a national truth. There was a national story that we all agreed on in some ways. And that could be bad. Noam Chomsky's famous book, Manufacturing Consent, that could be bad. When the mainstream media got it wrong, there was a truth that wasn't true. But I think having a national conversation was important. And all of the fragmenting and fracturing has brought some good things into it. Back in the day, if you weren't a journalist, you weren't going to get your voice heard. The only way to get heard was through journalistic outlets. And now you can have your podcast and be working at a tech company, and people who are investors can be heard on Twitter. And there's a lot of good in that. But I think the fragmenting of truth, the lack of responsibility for either headlines that mislead or for doing the basics of journalism, like giving people a chance to comment before you write incendiary things about them, and then just the lack of investment in local news, I think, is also hugely problematic. The New York Times is doing really well, and that's great. But I'm not sure we want a world where the Times is the only voice out there.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, the Times, they're just growing. They got Ezra Klein, they got Kara Swisher, they're getting all these giant voices from these other outlets, and it's becoming the end all be all for a lot of the big media stuff. But I,
Yeah.
in my experience, I think you're spot on. I just don't see a lot of good incentives for journalists to do the hard work of, like what we talked about earlier, creating, if there is nuance in a story, that's bad.
Yeah.
Even if it's true, nuance can be bad because that creates an unclickable link. Extremes click, and it's created an environment where there are just bad incentives for journalists to like really just tell the honest truth a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think so too. I was struck by a headline just recently in the past week, and I think it was in the Journal. I'm not sure, but it was about how this new strain of the virus in the UK was more lethal, and and that was the headline. And most people probably didn't read past the headline, and you read the story, and the story itself had this almost impenetrable statements about how, well, actually in the hospital, people who are hospitalized aren't dying at any faster at any we're not seeing people die at a higher rate, but we think maybe among those people who aren't going to the hospital that they might be dying faster. It was nonsensical under the headline, right? And I'm not saying that it is or isn't more lethal, but clearly a headline was slapped on this piece that was going to get lots and lots of clicks without a thoughtful, or at least if there was a thoughtful explanation of what was going on, the journalist completely didn't understand it and mangled it. And I thought it's everything that's wrong.
Right. And I also think too, like you said earlier, there isn't really like there isn't that same responsibility toward your story. I think a modern journalist wants to have a big kind of fancy job, and when they get things wrong, bearing the brunt of the responsibility, it costs a lot less to be wrong right now, and you can say whatever you want, and maybe you trend on Twitter for a day or something, but then you're right back to it in certain instances if you're on the right side of the narrative.
Yes.
But I also think there's this fast food story mentality where, a lot of the things I witnessed was like people not actually checking if things were true, and they're taking it from other sources. Oh, our competitor's writing about this, so we need to get on it so we can beat them in the Google index to get all these clicks. And it just seems like almost like a fast food restaurant of just trying to get stories out.
That's actually a really interesting analogy, and I think there's some truth to that. And it's not great because the public knows, and that's why trust in media is at an all-time low. It's not just that we're such a partisan country, although that's obviously part of it, but it's that every time you look at a headline and then you read the underlying story and it doesn't reflect what the headline says, or you happen to know something about what's being written about and you see that it's wrong,
right.
And that it even for me, it weakens my faith in the media. And then there's the good news is that every time I think the end is near, there are always people who are doing good work and who are investing in things. So I worry that the sort of journalism I've done, which is mainly long form writing, that it's harder and harder because if you're on your own, you have much more of an incentive to do stories that you know are going to work, so you can get paid, right?
Sure.
And the old model where as long as you did a couple of really great pieces a year, you could have a few pieces that didn't work out and you were on staff. So if they didn't work out, you still got to buy dinner that night, whatever else. It's very different than the world today. And I think an equally insidious part of what we're talking about is the rise of commentary. And that's because commentary is cheaper for everybody, right? You don't have to do original reporting to do commentary. You just take other people's original reporting, what little of it there is, and then you comment on top of that. But as much as we complain that Google and Facebook are parasites sitting on the back of the old media, which they are, commentary is a parasite too, because it's killing its host, right? And its host is the original reporting out there. But the rise of commentary is slowly eating away at the foundations of the stuff that people comment on.
Yeah.
in the end, it's a model that doesn't work because if the original research and the original journalism ceases to exist, then what do people have to comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that brings up another point of I think it's less. I've noticed this trend too of a modern journalist survives and can thrive only by building their own personal brand of journalism. Almost, they have a personality on Twitter, and they have all these. They have a very specific lane that they go in what they write about, how they talk about it, a beat as they call it. But I would even. It's not even so much as a beat as a narrative that they're pushing. And one bad part about that model is when maybe the truth of a story goes against the narrative of the brand, quote unquote, you're trying to build for yourself, independent of if you're a writer for the New York Times or if you're a writer for The Atlantic or whoever you write for, you above all of that, you have your own personal brand that you're trying to push forward to survive. And I see this all the time where it's I'll read a story and it's clearly not fully true or clearly not nuanced in a way that I would have hoped, knowing as someone who knows the other side, there's some detail you're missing, clearly, but it's just becoming easier and easier for someone to miss that detail for the sake of bolstering their own personal brand on social media. And that's a trend I keep seeing as well.
Yeah, and I think it's back to this question of human nature. I think it's almost often more instinctually human than it is even strategic. And what I mean by that is that when you write something, what you're going to get liked for and what you're going to get disliked for. And if you go against your brand or you take on certain sacred cows, you're going to get a lot of pushback, as you experienced with your tweet about Elon Musk, right? And so your just very human incentive is not to do that because it's really not fun to be told you're a horrible person and people would like to kill you. So your incentive is much more to play to type so that you get the good feedback from your group of people. And so it creates this very vicious circle of truth and narrative where the more followers you have, the more inclined you are to play to type and to give them what they expect so that you get the feedback that makes you feel good. And I think it's just very human. I'm not even sure. I'm sure in some cases it's strategic, but I think it's more just human.
Yeah, more primal. I can totally see that. It's just
that's a good word.
It's
more
a
primal.
survival instinct. I'm curious your thoughts. Now that Trump is gone, I had this thought. Is this bad news? Even worse news for the media business? Because I wondered how much Donald Trump and media had such a horribly toxic but very lucrative relationship to one another. He benefited exponentially, but so did media because people are clicking on these crazy stories about the guy 24/7. Do you think there are any real implications around that? Like I saw it was like the day after the inauguration, the story that was trending was like Biden has a Peloton. And I was like, "Oh, this is bad news. If this is what people are writing about now, I wonder if the business model is even less sustainable."
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's an interesting question, and for sure, the media created Trump, right? The media was the oxygen that he needed to blow himself up to the levels that he attained. If the press had just ignored him, it's unclear if he ever even would have been a viable candidate, right? So that relationship was toxic and twisted, and ultimately really not good for this country. I think. And it's very ironic that the media that hates Trump so desperately and so did not want him to be president is in effect the reason that he attained the power that he did. There's something very dark and twisted in that. I think. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. I'm hoping that it marks, I think you're right for sure. So friends of mine have said to me, God, I used to feel like I had to read every word of the New York Times so I didn't miss one thing about Trump that I needed to understand. And now I found myself looking at the paper and being like, eh. So right. It'll be interesting that you now take 4 years of media training people for one more scandalous headline than another about Trump. Can you steer people back to calm, important pieces about the policy Biden's trying to make? I don't know. Has the media created its own monster? And then there's another question on top of that I think is also. I'm not sure. I'm mixed on this. There was a piece that Forbes ran saying we are going to cover every company that hires someone from the Trump administration with a special scrutiny that we have never brought to anything before. And you, corporate America, are on notice if you hire anyone from this administration, that we're just going to go after you. And I was like, yes, but no. We should be doing that for anybody who comes out of any administration. The media should be applying total scrutiny and skepticism to this. And the idea that people who come out of the Trump administration somehow deserve a special level of scrutiny, I don't know. I could argue that both ways, but there's something about that I find a continuation of the same unhelpful dynamic or pernicious dynamic that propelled Trump to power.
Right. Yeah. This may be controversial of me to say, but to be quite honest, a lot of that behavior it starts to become a mirror image of itself. Of
Yes.
The far right and the far left, to me, are starting to look more and more like each other. And I know it's probably an unpopular opinion to take, but it's just true. But I do find that a lot of times, like that type of behavior, yeah, specifically people who are coming out of the Trump administration need to be watched for the rest of their lives and like never hire any of these people again. It feels extreme in the way that they would hate if it were going the other direction.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's an emotive quality to all of this that is, don't pay attention, don't analyze the facts of what I'm saying, don't look at the truth of what I'm saying. It's the appeal to emotion of the personality, right back to this idea of narrative over numbers. It's the appeal of the narrative and the appeal to our emotions. And I think that can be true on both the left and the right. And there's also, for all that people are rightly freaked out about the totalitarian, authoritarian qualities in Trump, the same is true on the far left. So you can have somebody on the far right with authoritarian qualities, and the same on the far left. And if you don't like that, then you shouldn't like it in either place, right? It's equally, maybe it's not equally frightening, but it's something to watch out for on either end of the political spectrum.
Sure. Instead of pretending they don't look anything like one another, like at least acknowledging they are evil twins at the very least.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious your thoughts on the rise of the Substack journalism. I think this is a whole new trend that's coming out of a lot of what we just talked about as far as like working in a traditional newsroom, where maybe I think Glenn Greenwald and Barry Wise are some of the bigger names who have recently left jobs in a traditional newsroom to just write for Substack. And Substack, for context, is a paid email newsletter. So people essentially pay them a monthly fee to get their written content online. And this seems to be a trend that's only growing, basically, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And I've seen good arguments for both sides. I'm curious your thoughts on the rise of the Substack journalism.
So I'm all for anything that allows journalists to make money and for journalism to continue to exist. And the more diversity, the better. The more business models out there that people are trying that offer a path forward, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or whatever the saying is. That said, I think there could be some unappealing aspects to the Substack model, and one is that at its worst, it could intensify the dynamic that we've spoken about, where you cater to your audience, and you have to keep your audience pleased because they're the ones who are paying you. And so, at its worst, it can intensify that dynamic where you give your audience what you know they want because they're the ones who are putting the food on your table. That hasn't, at its best, that's not what's being practiced. I think Andrew Sullivan, I think Matt Taibbi, they can be counted on to offend their audiences as much as to cater to what they want. And they built an audience that wants that. And so that's then really good, right? If you have people who have strong enough voices and are willing to slay their own sacred cows, then that can be pretty great. But I think the fundamental problem with it is that it is still, you have to feed the beast. So if you're on Substack and you're getting paid by your readers, you have to produce. You can't take 6 months and work on an investigative piece that may not pan out. And there is there's a perverse incentive when you're doing a piece that has to work, right? Because then you're going to make it into a story, even if it's not a story. And so the freedom to walk away from a piece is one of the most unacknowledged problems, I think, in journalism today,
Mm,
because it's harder for all of us. And I think even if you are on staff at a publication, because the demand for content is so insatiable, it's harder for all of us to say, you know what, this didn't work. I thought this was a great idea. I thought there was a story here, but there really isn't. And I think for journalism to really function, there has to be the freedom to walk away from a story.
yeah. How often would you say you walk away from a story?
So less frequently in my years as a freelancer than I did beforehand. And I've tried to do stories that could be whatever they were, that were stories regardless of whatever point of view I ended up having, so that I didn't have the incentives to make them into something. But for sure, my choice of story has been influenced by that. So I guess I think about the last big pieces I've written for Vanity Fair, whether it was about Elon Musk or I did a piece on the Sacklers. And in either of those cases, because in either of those cases, if the story could have been whatever it was, because Musk is enough of a draw that if it turned out, oh wow, all these skeptics of Buffalo are wrong, and this is actually great, and here's how this whole thing is going to work, then that could have been the
Mm,
story, right? But for sure, I think in a more subtle way, the I I've been influenced in my story selections by needing the piece to work in some way, shape, or form.
yeah.
I don't think that's influenced the point of view I've taken. I've tried to be careful about that, but there are all sorts of pernicious motivations.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think totally. And I think going back to the Substack talk, one thing I just remembered was when I was still in the news organization that I was in, it was the rise. I think it was right after Glenn Greenwald left The Intercept. And one of my coworkers, he was very familiar with Glenn and all this stuff. And he was really arguing to me, this is a bad move because this is what he told me, every writer needs an editor.
Yeah.
And when you move to Substack, you no longer have an editor, someone to basically balance you out on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, what you're saying and what you're not saying. And my argument to this person was, what if the editor has their agenda too? And I think that's why a lot of these people are leaving, but I don't know if there's a happy medium, because it's almost like both sides can have their own problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've been, but back to I was thinking about this. I don't know that I would have been, say the Enron story came around
Yeah.
now. I don't know that I would be able to do that in my current configuration, right? So I worked on that story for what, 2 months before it was published, but I had the freedom that if it hadn't been a story, if the Enron guys had perfect explanations for how their business worked, we could have said, no, I guess we're not running this,
Right.
right? And that's a kind of freedom that is really hard to come by today. But back to your question, I've been lucky. I've always worked with editors who have had a fealty to the story and to the truth of the story. And so I have not felt, I guess I've had a few experiences that haven't been great in that respect, but very few.
Mm.
Most of the long form editors I've worked with, from Fortune to Vanity Fair, have been have been have wanted the story to be good and well written and catch people's attention, but I've not felt an agenda coming in other than to make the writing better.
Yeah.
Sometimes fix my inability to express myself coherently, I've never felt that an editor was trying to shape the story into a pre-existing point of view that they had.
Gotcha. That's good. That's good to know. I think that's a good note.
But I've worked with old school editors for the most part too. So
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I can see it going both ways, but I think the fragmentation that you were mentioning earlier, I could see that being a problem down the line of everyone's just saying their opinion, but louder and to a paid audience. And that there are some pretty interesting implications there, to say the very least. I'm curious, you said earlier that you mentioned that there are some voices who you think are doing a really good job right now. I just wanted to give you some airtime to say who those people are. Who are some people who you enjoy? You mentioned Andrew Sullivan, maybe some others right now?
yeah, I think at least Andrew Sullivan can be counted on to be provocative and to take the risk of offending his audience and offending people. And I think without that, without that, you have to be willing to risk something when you write. And you have to be willing to speak your truth, whatever that may be. I'm going to less name specific people than I am institutions. So I think ProPublica does really good work. They take on the wonky stories that maybe aren't going to be headline grabbing clickbait and do really thorough, deep investigations. I think there's been some really good local journalism on the pandemic. I think the Minneapolis Star Tribune did a really good investigation into a nursing home in Minneapolis, exploring why the number of deaths in this nursing home was so high, and it was really detailed and thoughtful. The piece in the New York Times that ran recently on the school suicides, the suicides in the Las Vegas area, and what's actually happening to kids, I think that was really good. So I think there still is a lot of really good work that is just grounded in the old school tenets of journalism. Here's what's happening on the ground. There was a wonderful New Yorker piece I read recently on explaining why it is that, looking at how San Francisco had succeeded and not succeeded in tackling the pandemic, and if there's a narrative out there that is very appealing to everybody today, that narrative, one of those narratives, I think, is that we only have spread because of bad people who aren't following the rules and regulations and aren't wearing their masks, and it's bad, selfish human beings who are throwing house parties. And this story looked at who it was and where the spread was, and it was generally in essential workers who had to go to work, and in nursing homes where people were trapped. And so I think to undercut that moralistic strain of, if everybody were only not selfish, stupid, bad people, we wouldn't have a problem, was so important and so well done. And again, it wasn't a piece, if you think the New Yorker overall has a political bias such that it is going to be bad, stupid Republicans who are spreading the virus, this was a piece that actually looked at what was happening on the ground. And again, just great old school reporting.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to check out that piece. I think that takes me into, it's not really about journalism per se, but it is. And I want to get your take on the pandemic. I've noticed, I follow you on Twitter and you have thoughts on it. And I would love to hear your thoughts, both as parents. You're a parent dealing with all this, just like every other parent in the world trying to handle this right now. That's complicated, but also just your opinion across the board of how it's being handled and maybe those narratives that are surrounding it.
Yeah, so I'm going to caveat all of this with an I don't know, right? I don't
always
think,
appreciate that. Anyone who can say, I don't know, that's awesome.
I really don't. I felt strongly from the beginning of this that the evidence was pointing toward children not being super spreaders, and that the risks of keeping schools closed and keeping kids out of school were going to obviate everything we've been saying about a more equal society, because it was going to hurt those kids whose parents couldn't afford to create schooling options for them, whose parents only had the public schools. And now you look at the numbers, and whatever the most recent estimate are, 1 to 3 million kids who have just gone missing. I don't know how we as a country, I don't know how those children ever recover from this. There was a McKinsey study talking about how loss of even a couple of months of school for kids in tough situations is just devastating to them. I don't know how those children recover from that, and I don't know how we as a country recover from that. And I've thought from the beginning that if we care about our kids half as much as we say we do, everything in our society is, oh, our kids, they're the most important thing. Being a mom, our kids, our kids, our kids. And yet when push came to shove, we didn't really care about our kids at all. We've left those kids just to flounder, both the government and society at large. That's one thing I felt strongly about. I have not understood why the conflation between one's political point of view and one's views on the virus is emblematic to me of everything that we're speaking about, appeals to emotion versus numbers. Why your view on how we should handle the virus is a reflection of your politics. The two things have nothing to do with each other, right? I actually think that if you do tend to believe what most people in your political camp believe, then you should question it. Because one thing is an analytic scientific thing, and the other is politics, and they shouldn't necessarily overlap. I have not understood why. This is probably going to get me in hot water, but I'll say it anyway since I have said versions of it on Twitter. I have not understood why it makes you a bad person to debate whether lockdowns were the right approach to this, given the cost not only to children, given the fact that in many states, 40 to 70% of the deaths have been in nursing homes, and the lockdowns didn't do anything to protect those people, given the clear disparities between who can lock down and who can't, and the fact that lockdown for many white collar professionals has meant having essential workers deliver your goods to your house. I'll never forget a New York Times op-ed at the start of the pandemic that said every American should lock down and should shelter in place. And then it went on to say, only go out when you're going to your pharmacy or and have your groceries delivered. And I was like, yeah, and what about the Americans who have to do that work?
Right. Who's at the pharmacy running the counter?
Right. So again, I don't know. I'm willing to believe that in 6 months it could be so obvious that we should have locked down and locked down harder. I don't know, but I don't understand, given the enormous costs of lockdowns and given that they obviously have failed to save 30 to 70% of the lives that have been lost in nursing homes, why we can't have a conversation about why even raising that question makes you a bad human being, who another person on Twitter has accused me of being pro-death. Why does it make me pro-death to raise a question about how we can most effectively save lives and protect people? And again, I say that without knowing the answer at all, but just to me, it's not obvious that we have the answer.
Yeah, you said at the earlier that 1 to 3 million kids are missing. What did you mean by that? Like, they're missing in what way? From school?
So there's a number, and it was in an NPR piece, that they haven't shown up, and that from the time school went online last spring, these kids are just gone. They're vanished from the system. And it's particularly true in the big urban public school systems, CPS, where I am, LA United, New York, where kids they didn't show up online, and they're gone. They're gone from the system. Nobody knows what's happened to them. And so that, I think, is a huge issue, right? And the increase in hello, you can see my dog in the
I know, I saw
background
your
here.
dog perk up when mine barked. That's awesome.
The increase in child abuse, the increase in kids going hungry. I don't know how we recover from that as a country and those kids. But I think it's a huge issue that, to me, at least should raise the question: have we handled this well? Is this the right thing to do in the future?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think it's crazy to me that up until just talking to you, I haven't heard that at all. That 1 to 3 million kids are just not in school, period, right now, and no one can really they're not really able to track where they are, and that to me gives me pause of, wow, how do we recover from that? And I don't, and for me, I'll be fully on board that I've been like the total pro lockdown, pro all these initiatives, probably because of just the narrative in my head, what works. I'm privileged enough to be able to work from home. So is my wife. We have essential workers who can deliver things to us. We're very comfy and cozy in our situation. And so hearing the other side of this is like really eye-opening to me. And I think you raised some really good points about, like, what are the long-term implications? I know that a big argument has been for the mental health side of this. I don't know. I don't have the numbers on suicide and depression and things like that, but I have to imagine they've gone up through this. Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the cost being outside of just people dying from the virus, but the effect on the country as a whole.
It's what we don't do well as a society, because the deaths from the pandemic can be measured in the here and now. The costs from the lockdown are going to play out over the next 10, 20 years. And so we don't do well thinking about long-term costs versus short-term costs. And I do not mean to imply that every life lost isn't a tragedy, but layer on top of my point about the long-term costs, the fact that lockdowns as implemented in the US and in most of the West have not done anything to protect people in long-term care homes. And that's been where, so how can you look at a strategy that didn't prevent 40 to 70% of deaths and say, we did this perfectly? This was the right thing to do. Maybe you wanted to lock down and have a strategy to prevent deaths in long-term care facilities, or maybe you didn't want to lock down and you wanted to have a strategy that prevented deaths in long-term care facilities, that really devoted the resources toward that, or devoted the money toward workers in communities where there's generational living and they can't stay home. Maybe take some of the resources that have been devoted to bailing out the economy and helping the rich get richer and send them in that direction instead. And again, I don't know that any of that's right, but I don't understand why those are questions that can't be asked.
Sure. Yeah, I think I have one more question for you because I know we're running low on time, and it's broad, but I would love for you to dig deep for me if you can about this. Is right now, it can be in journalism, could be in media, could be the pandemic, probably maybe not the pandemic because I think that's like top of mind for everybody, but what, maybe in journalism specifically, in modern media, what keeps you up at night? What worries you? And maybe the inverse, maybe after you answer that, what leaves you optimistic about the current landscape as well?
Of the media or of our world at large?
Let's go with the media. I think the world at large, that's a little bit, I should have prepped you for that one. It's a little too philosophical.
I think what makes me optimistic is the sheer diversity of voices, that information is less trapped than it used to be. When I wrote about Enron, there was a small cadre of short sellers who were skeptical of Enron, and that information traveled in that closed loop, and those people were all skeptical. But the mainstream narrative was that this was the world's greatest company, right? And so now, if you think of the difference with Tesla, whichever camp is right or wrong, you can find all the research you want to know about Tesla right on Twitter. It's available to everybody. If you are skeptical or think you might be skeptical and you're looking to make an investment in Tesla and you're like, yeah, but I should understand this bear case, there it all is right there for you to understand. And that multiplicity of voices offering different sources of different information can be a huge plus. You just have to be willing to expose yourself to it, right? And say, okay, I may not want to hear this piece of information, but if I'm willing to look for it, I can get it. I can hear it. And I think that's great. The idea that not everything has to be mediated through the traditional media, is that redundant? Is a really good thing. I think on a less optimistic note, I don't know how the dynamics of social media, our increased desire for clickbait, our short attention spans, our increasingly emotional response to content, that social media, the traditional media played on that too, but social media has just honed that to such a fine point. I don't know that we can go back from that. The genie's out of the bottle, and I don't know that remembering how to read a thoughtful, nuanced piece that doesn't appeal to your emotions and doesn't make you feel good about yourself. I don't know. It's like being told that all you have to do is eat your favorite form of dessert forever, and now suddenly you have to eat spinach again. Like, no, I've forgotten how to make myself eat spinach. Do I really have to do this? So it's a form of training your mind that I worry we're no longer capable of.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas of how we could train our minds to be better at that?
I think each you have to take responsibility for it yourself, right? You have to read pieces that you think you may not like. You have to read long form pieces that require commitment and concentration to the topic. But you have to take responsibility for it, I think. It's like the same thing as exercising during the day so that you keep your body in somewhat decent shape. Harder and harder with every day that this goes on, right? But the same is true of training your mind. We all take it for granted that exercising, physical exercise, is the same, is a good thing and something we should have in our lives. But mental exercise is important too. The analogy would be sitting on your couch all day watching terrible TV and eating bonbons and never getting up to do any exercise and expecting your body to be fit and able to walk and run. And we're doing the same thing with our media consumption, right? If you train your mind to only want quick hits that are satisfying emotionally, that deliver the content and the outrage or the whatever, then that's, you're not going to be able to handle something that requires more intense concentration.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end.
I'm not sure I said that very
No,
well,
you
but
said it
anyway.
great. I think taking responsibility for what we consume, you are what you eat. I think you're spot
Yeah,
on, and that goes across. That's for food and media. What we put in our minds is what we ultimately become and how we think. So I think you're spot on.
thank you for saying it much better than I did.
Bethany, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Have a great Sunday.